Flames against the night sky, a prophet standing alone, and a nation holding its breath. This is not just a story about fire. It's about the moment heaven answered with flames. Welcome to Midnight Psalms, where we bring the Bible to life in the quiet hours, uncovering moments of raw faith, human struggle, and divine power. If you're ready to journey deep into the Word, you're in the right place. The air was thick with tension on Mount Carmel. The sky hung heavy, grey with the weight of a long drought, and the people of Israel stood in a wide circle, eyes shifting between the prophet Elijah and the 450 prophets of Baal. For years, the nation had wandered between two opinions, sometimes calling on the God of their fathers, other times bowing to idols. But now, the challenge had been set. The God who answers by fire will be the true God. Elijah's voice had cut through the murmurs, calm, yet unshakable, calling the people closer, and as they gathered, the wind seemed to die down, as if heaven itself leaned in to listen. On one side, an altar prepared by the prophets of Baal would neatly stacked, a bull laid upon it, but no fire. On the other, the ground where Elijah would soon rebuild an ancient altar to the Lord, stones weathered by time but still strong. The people didn't know it yet, but this day would carve itself into history, a turning point for their faith, and for the hearts that had grown cold. There was no music, no chants yet, only the quiet before a storm no one could imagine was coming. The prophets of Baal started early in the morning, shouting their prayers to their God, circling the altar, hands lifted high, voices growing hoarse. They called louder and louder, from sunrise to noon, their faces dripping with sweat, their bodies trembling from the strain, but nothing happened. Elijah stood nearby, silent at first, watching them exhaust themselves, their hope crumbling with each unanswered cry. The people shifted uncomfortably, glancing at one another, wondering how long this would go on. Baal's prophets cut themselves, as was their custom, letting their own blood flow to prove their devotion, yet the altar remained cold, the sacrifice untouched. Some in the crowd began to look toward Elijah, perhaps with curiosity, perhaps with the faintest spark of hope. The prophet finally spoke, his tone edged with sharp truth, asking if maybe Baal was sleeping, or traveling, or too busy to answer. The crowd stirred, a murmur of nervous laughter escaping some lips, but deep down, they felt the weight of the silence, a silence that spoke louder than the shouts. When it was finally Elijah's turn, the sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the mountains in amber light. The prophet called the people to come closer, his voice firm yet inviting, and they pressed in, eager to see what he would do. Before anything else, Elijah began to rebuild the altar of the Lord, using 12 stones to represent the 12 tribes of Israel, a silent reminder of their covenant with God. With each stone laid, there was a sense of restoration, as if something ancient was being repaired not just in the altar, but in the hearts of the people. He arranged the wood, cut the bull into pieces, and laid it on the altar. But then, in a move that defied all human logic, he called for water. Not once, but 3 times, he commanded that large jars be filled and poured over the sacrifice until the trench around the altar overflowed. In the middle of a drought, this was a bold and reckless act, unless you believed in a God who could answer in ways no one else could. The people whispered, some frowning, others leaning forward in anticipation, because they knew, if fire came now, it would be undeniable. As the final drops of water soaked the sacrifice, Elijah stepped back, lifted his face to the heavens, and began to pray. There were no theatrics, no shouting, no frantic gestures, only a simple, direct appeal to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel. His words were clear, asking God to let the people know that he alone was God and that Elijah was his servant, acting only at his command. The silence that followed was unlike anything they had felt all day, a deep, almost sacred stillness that seemed to stretch time, and then, in a moment that no one could have scripted, fire fell from heaven, not a spark, not a flicker, but a torrent of flame so fierce it consumed the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, the water, and even the dust. The heat hit the crowd like a wave, their faces lit by the blaze, their eyes wide with shock. A collective gasp rose from the people, followed by a cry that rolled across the mountains. "The Lord, He is God! The Lord, He is God!" Hearts that had wandered were suddenly anchored again, and the drought in their souls broke before the drought in the land. The shouts echoed off the cliffs, rolling like thunder through the valleys below, and for the first time in years, the people's voices were united. No one argued, no one doubted, because they had seen with their own eyes what no man could fabricate. Elijah, still standing near the altar's smoking remains, gave instructions with the same calm authority he had shown all day. The false prophets, once so loud and confident, now stood frozen, their faces pale, the weight of defeat pressing heavily on them. The people moved quickly, following Elijah's command to seize them, for the nation could no longer afford to let deception hold sway. As the crowd surged forward, the mountain wind shifted, carrying away the acrid scent of burnt offering and replacing it with the faintest hint of rain in the distance. It was as if the heavens, having displayed their fire, were now preparing to release water. But Elijah's work was not yet done. There was still the drought to break, and for that, he would climb higher into the mountain, alone, to speak with God again. Elijah ascended to the summit, leaving the noise of the crowd far below. Each step was deliberate, his robe brushing against the rocky path, the air cooler and thinner with the climb. When he reached the top, he bowed low to the ground, his face between his knees, and began to pray for rain. There was no lightning now, no fire, only a man, humbled before his Creator, whispering the desperate petition of a thirsty land. He sent his servant to look toward the sea, but the report came back empty. Nothing, just an endless stretch of blue meeting the horizon. Elijah did not waver. He sent the servant again, and again, 6 times in all, each time receiving the same answer. There is nothing. Yet faith is not built on sight alone, and Elijah's persistence was a living sermon that the nation would never forget. On the 7th time, the servant returned with a different tone in his voice, a small cloud, the size of a man's hand, rising from the sea. It was enough. Elijah rose to his feet, a small smile crossing his face as he sent word to King Ahab. "Prepare your chariot and go down before the rain stops you." The king, still processing the events of the fire, obeyed without hesitation, the urgency in Elijah's voice leaving no room for doubt. The wind began to stir, the first cool gusts sweeping across the mountain, carrying with them the scent of wet earth that had been absent for 3 long years. Dark clouds gathered quickly, thick and heavy, swallowing the last colors of sunset. The first drops began to fall, slow at first, then faster, until the rain became a pounding roar that soaked the earth, the people, and even the stones of the altar. The land drank deeply, the dust dissolving into mud beneath their feet. For Elijah, it was more than weather. It was proof that God's covenant still stood, that his mercy could still be poured out on a people who had wandered, but now had turned their faces back toward him. As the storm grew, Elijah tucked his cloak into his belt and, filled with supernatural strength, began to run down the mountain ahead of Ahab's chariot. The rain lashed against his face, his feet striking the muddy ground with relentless speed. The king's horses galloped at full pace, yet the prophet outran them, a living testament that when God empowers a mission, no obstacle, not even nature itself, can slow it down. Those who watched from a distance could barely comprehend what they were seeing: a lone man, soaked to the bone, sprinting ahead of royal horses in a torrent of rain, his eyes fixed not on the palace but on the God who had just shown himself in both fire and water. By the time they reached Jezreel, the streets were running with streams, and the people stood outside their homes, lifting their faces to the sky, letting the rain wash away the dust and perhaps something deeper, the residue of years spent far from the truth. That night, as fires burned low in the homes and the rain continued to fall, the story of what had happened on Mount Carmel spread like wildfire. Parents told their children, neighbors whispered to one another, and even the most stubborn hearts felt a tremor of awe. Somewhere in the stillness between raindrops, the people realized they had witnessed something they could never unsee, the direct, undeniable hand of God. Yet Elijah, somewhere apart from the noise, understood a deeper truth. Moments like these are not given to fuel pride, but to awaken repentance. Fire from heaven is not for spectacle, but for transformation. And though the nation had bowed that day, the work of keeping their hearts aligned with the Lord would require daily surrender. Still, for this moment, they rested in the sound of rain, a sound that, to them, was as sacred as any hymn. In the years to come, old men would still recount the day when fire fell and the skies broke open. Children would grow up hearing the tale as if it were the heartbeat of their heritage. The mountain would remain, silent witness to the day God answered with flame and water, and Elijah's name would be spoken not as that of a showman, but of a servant who trusted completely, who dared to drench a sacrifice in the middle of a drought, who prayed for rain before a cloud appeared, who ran with the wind of heaven at his back. It was more than a victory over false prophets. It was a reminder that faith is not a gamble, but a certainty when placed in the hands of the living God. And as long as Israel remembered that, the droughts, both in sky and in spirit, would never hold them captive again. If you are enjoying this video, please like, subscribe and hit the notification bell to help this channel reach more people. Now let's continue. The next morning, the mountain was quiet again, but the air still held the echo of what had happened. The earth was dark and rich from the rain, the scent of wet soil mixing with the faint char of the altar's remains. People passed by in small groups, some touching the stones as if to confirm they were real, others simply standing in silence, letting their minds replay the fire's descent. There was a sense of renewal in the air, yet beneath it all, a warning lingered. This was not just a spectacle to be remembered, but a call to live differently. Elijah, away from the crowd, walked the narrow paths that wound down the mountain, his mind already on the next steps God would require of him. He knew the battle for Israel's heart was far from over, and that the true challenge was not in moments of visible power, but in the slow, daily faithfulness that follows them. The fire had been the spark, but now the people would need to carry the flame in their own lives. Far from the mountain, in Jezreel, the news had reached the queen, Jezebel. Her fury was like the heat of the fire that had consumed the altar, but without its purity. The defeat of her prophets was not just a religious loss, it was a direct strike at her power, and she swore vengeance on Elijah. The prophet's heart, though strong in faith, still carried human fear, and as the threat reached his ears, the weight of exhaustion and danger pressed down. The same man who had called fire from heaven now found himself running for his life, proof that even the boldest servants of God are not immune to moments of weakness. Yet even in this, there was a lesson for Israel. The victories on mountaintops do not erase the valleys that follow, but they do remind us who walks with us through both. Elijah's footsteps carried him deeper into the wilderness, away from the noise, toward the only voice that could restore his strength. Under the shade of a solitary broom tree in the desert, Elijah collapsed, the journey and the weight of his calling pressing him into the dust. He prayed not for victory, not for strength, but for release, that his work might be over. The same man who had faced down hundreds now whispered his weariness to the God who had sent him. Yet heaven did not answer with fire this time, nor with rain, but with something far gentler, an angel, touching him and offering freshly baked bread and water. The prophet ate, drank, and rested, the food tasting like more than nourishment, like a reminder that God's provision comes in many forms. When he awoke, the angel was there again, urging him to eat more, for the journey ahead would be long. This was not the end of his story. It was a pause, a divine breath before the next great step, and in that moment Elijah began to understand that God's power is not always loud, but it is always enough. Strengthened by the food, Elijah walked 40 days and nights until he reached Mount Horeb, the mountain of God. There, he found a cave and took shelter, the silence of the place wrapping around him like a cloak. Then the word of the Lord came to him, asking a question that pierced deeper than any accusation. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" The prophet poured out his heart, speaking of his zeal, his loneliness, his fear, and his frustration that the people had turned away despite all he had done. God did not rebuke him, but told him to stand on the mountain in his presence. What came next would shift Elijah's understanding forever. First, a wind tore through the mountains, powerful enough to shatter rocks, but God was not in the wind. Then an earthquake shook the ground, but God was not in the earthquake. Then fire blazed again, but God was not in the fire. Finally, there came a gentle whisper, and in that whisper, Elijah covered his face, for he knew he was standing before the Almighty. The whisper carried no thunder, no blaze, yet it filled the cave with a presence that could not be ignored. In that still, small voice, God renewed Elijah's mission, reminding him that he was not alone, that there were still 7,000 in Israel who had not bowed to Baal. The prophet's weariness began to lift, not because his circumstances had changed, but because his perspective had. God's plan was still unfolding, and Elijah was still part of it. He left Mount Horeb not as a man who had just witnessed fire or storms, but as one who had learned to recognize the quiet strength that sustains between the miracles. The journey back would not be easy, but it would be guided, and that was enough. For all who would hear his story, the lesson would be clear: God speaks in the fire, but he also speaks in the whisper, and both are equally powerful in the lives of those who listen. Years later, the memory of Mount Carmel would still stir the hearts of the faithful. It was a reminder that God can move in sudden, undeniable displays of power, but also that his most transformative work often happens in the unseen, day by day. Elijah's story became a mirror for anyone caught between faith and fear, showing that both courage and exhaustion can live in the same heart. It showed that faith is not a constant mountaintop, but a journey through peaks and valleys, where the same God reigns in both. The mountain itself remained as a silent witness, its rocks unchanged, its view stretching over the same valleys where Israel once decided whom they would serve, and every time the wind passed over it, perhaps it carried with it an echo, the roar of the fire, the cry of the people, and the still, small voice that followed. In the end, the fire on Mount Carmel was never about proving Elijah's greatness, it was about restoring God's name in a land where it had been forgotten. The rain that followed was more than water for the fields, it was a symbol of mercy for a parched nation, and the whisper on Mount Horeb was not about rebuke, but about reminding a weary servant that his story was not finished. For those who would read these events generations later, it would serve as a chain of moments, each linked by the same truth. God's ways are not confined to one kind of miracle. Sometimes he answers with a blaze that lights up the sky, sometimes with rain that softens the earth, and sometimes with a whisper that softens the soul. All of it is power, and all of it is love, reaching out to a people who often forget, yet are never forgotten. When people gathered around their fires at night, they would speak of the prophet who called down flames in a drought, who prayed until clouds formed, who outran horses in the rain, and who heard God's voice in a whisper. Some would tell it with awe, others with longing, but all would agree. This was not just history, it was a call to trust the same God today. Children would grow up imagining the moment the fire fell, the heat on their faces, the light dancing in the eyes of their ancestors. They would learn that faith does not depend on perfect strength, because even Elijah had moments of doubt. What matters is that in both the roar of fire and the quiet of the whisper, he listened and obeyed, and that is the kind of faith that turns mountains into altars. As time passed, Mount Carmel returned to its daily rhythm, the wind sweeping through its grass, the sun painting its cliffs in gold at sunset, yet it remained a holy landmark, a place where heaven once touched earth. Travelers who climbed it could still feel the weight of the story in its stones, as if the ground itself remembered. They would stand where Elijah stood, imagining the crowd, the altar, the water, and the fire, and wonder if their own faith could stand in such a moment. Perhaps. That is why God leaves places like this, not so we can worship the mountain, but so we can remember the God who answered there. The same God who listens now, in our own battles, whether they feel like droughts or storms, and in remembering, hearts would be stirred to choose again, just as Israel once did. And so, the fire on Mount Carmel was not the end of Elijah's story, but a chapter in the greater story of a God who calls his people back, again and again. If this moment of faith, fire, and whisper has stirred something in you, take it as an invitation to listen for his voice, whether it comes in the roar or in the stillness. Here at Midnight Psalms, we share these timeless stories so they can keep shaping hearts in the quiet hours. If you want to walk deeper into the Word, to hear the echoes of faith that still speak, stay with us. There are more nights, more mountains, and more whispers to come.